Oh, okay. Hi, Fosco.
Hello. Hi.
Can you
Hello.
hear us well?
How are you? I'm pretty well, thank you. How are you?
Okay, yeah.
Let
Good.
me just try my just 1 second. All right. Can you hear me well?
Yes, I can hear you
Yeah,
very well.
absolutely.
Perfect. Okay. I also did it.
Okay, so can we start the webinar
The
now?
webinar.
Yeah.
Of course.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm ready.
Okay, start it.
This is actually a big coordination between across the globe.
It went pretty well. I believe so. I just wrote you a mail about the fact that I'm not using my mail at MICROCITIES.studio using for Zoom purposes. I actually use my academic mail. I don't know if so, maybe
Yes. Yeah, I kind of understand that because I'm also using my GSD email and I got like a free Zoom account, so why not?
yeah, I understand. All right.
Okay. So I think I will give the introduction first, and then in both English and Vietnamese, and then you can take it over. Okay. Okay. Tôi sẽ giới thiệu bằng tiếng Anh trước và sau đó là tiếng Việt. I will give an introduction in English first and then in Vietnamese. Since we only have so much time, I will keep it short. First of all, Phu Lang Sa and the Cricket Project, thank you, Fosco Lucarelli, and everyone for being here and spend precious weekend afternoon or evening time together. Trước hết, Phu Lang Sa và Cricket Project cảm ơn sự góp mặt của Fosco Lucarelli và tất cả các khán giả ở đây đã dành buổi tối cuối tuần quý báu cho buổi sự kiện này. Phu Lang Sa Collabtive, founded by Hình, is a community of young Vietnamese artists, architects, curators, designers, and cultural practitioners living abroad, in France primarily. And the aim is to foster interdisciplinary knowledge exchange among Vietnamese cultural practitioners. Phu Lang Sa Collabtive là một cộng đồng các nghệ sĩ, kiến trúc sư, giám tuyển, nhà thiết kế, những người thực hành các lĩnh vực văn hóa khác nhau sinh sống ở nước ngoài, phần lớn là ở Pháp, do nghệ sĩ Hình thành lập. Mục tiêu của nhóm là thúc đẩy sự trao đổi các kiến thức liên ngành giữa các thực hành văn hóa ở Việt Nam. Founded by book enthusiasts, the Cricket Project, located in Hanoi, is a library bookstore frequently organized art-related events such as film screening, poetry readings, and talk shows. Thank you, the Cricket Project, for being very supportive and rarely say no. Được mở ra bởi những người trẻ có niềm đam mê với sách vở, Cricket Project là một thư viện hiệu sách tại Hà Nội và thường xuyên tổ chức các sự kiện liên quan đến nghệ thuật, cũng như chiếu phim, đọc thơ, talk show. Cảm ơn các bạn, anh chị ở The Cricket Project đã hỗ trợ rất nhiều một cách không do dự. This is the 7th event of the series Phu Lang Sa Talk, take place in somewhat kind of like a unusual setting, both in a virtual space, which is a Zoom webinar, and also the physical space. Live screening at the Cricket Project. Đây là một sự kiện thứ 7 trong series Phu Lang Sa Talk, diễn ra trong một bối cảnh kép lạ thường hơn giữa không gian mạng, đó là Zoom, và không gian vật lý, đó là Cricket Project. Fosco Lucarelli, together with Mariabruna Fabrizi, are architects, teachers, and also designers, writers, editors, and curators. They are currently based in Paris, where they found what they describe as a double practice, MICROCITIES, and its counterpart, a visual atlas, SOC studio. They're both associate professors at the School of Architecture, ENSA Paris East. They have been invited curators for the Form of Form at the 2016 Lisbon Architecture Triennale. They organized the exhibition Inner Space at the 2019 Lisbon Triennale and the exhibition Data Network Interface, the Architecture of Information at the Archizoom Gallery of the EPFL in Lausanne in 2021. Both Inner Space and Data Network Interface, the Architecture of Information, also title of their two very beautiful and interesting books about the men researching topics which are the specializations of mental processes, relationship between architecture and information, and evolution of domestic space. Fosco Lucarelli cùng với Mariabruna Fabrizi là các kiến trúc sư, người giảng dạy và cũng là nhà thiết kế, nhà văn, nhà biên tập và là nhà giám tuyển. Cả hai sinh ra tại Ý và hiện đang làm việc tại Paris, nơi họ sáng lập một thực hành kép gồm có MICROCITIES và đối ứng với nó là một atlas trực quan Short Studio. Họ đều là giáo sư của trường kiến trúc ENSA Đông Paris. Họ là giám tuyển khách mời cho The Form of Form tại triển lãm kiến trúc tam niên Lisboa 2016. Họ tổ chức triển lãm Inner Space tại triển lãm kiến trúc tam niên Lisboa 2019 và Database Network Interface Architecture of Information bảo tàng Archizoom ở trường Bách khoa Liên bang Lausanne EPFL năm 2021. Đi cùng với hai triển lãm này đó là hai cuốn sách cùng tên rất đẹp và nhiều gợi mở xoay quanh đề tài nghiên cứu của họ về các cái sự hình thành không gian và các cái quá trình tinh thần, mối quan hệ giữa kiến trúc và thông tin và sự chuyển biến của không gian nhà ở. So why Fosco Lucarelli here and now? Besides the undoubtedly rare opportunity from Fosco Lucarelli, I believe architecture exists in many modes of practice. Through speech, readings, writings, exhibitions, curatorial practices, and publishings, architecture is unconstrained from its slow and costly physical construction practice, and allow us to have other different discourses to seek new relationships with society. By working with architecture in different domains, architecture then finds its remaining self in a much broader fabric, resonating and being resonated with other fields and disciplines. The practice of Fosco Lucarelli and Mariabruna Fabrizi is peculiar and strange, but they work on territories that are very familiar in the spirit of today. The online atlas Short Studio straddles between reinforcing and questioning boundaries between these disciplines. Tại sao lại là Fosco Lucarelli? Thì ngoài việc đơn giản đây là một cơ hội không thể bỏ qua, tôi tin rằng kiến trúc tồn tại theo nhiều cách thức thực hành khác nhau. Qua việc nói, đọc, viết, triển lãm, giám tuyển và xuất bản, kiến trúc được giải phóng phần nào khỏi việc thực hành xây cất vật lý, quá đổi là tốn kém và chậm chạp, cho phép chúng ta mở ra những diễn ngôn mới, đi tìm những mối quan hệ mới với xã hội. Bằng việc mở rộng kiến trúc sang các miền vận động khác, kiến trúc tìm thấy phần tồn tại khác của mình trong một mạng lưới lớn hơn, rung động và được rung động cùng với các ngành văn hóa và khoa học khác. Thực hành của Fosco Lucarelli và Mariabruna Fabrizi là một thực hành kiến trúc khác thường, nhưng lại làm việc trên cùng một vùng đất quen thuộc của ngày nay. Atlas trực tuyến của họ, Short Studio, đóng một vai trò kép giữa việc tra hỏi và tái khẳng định những ranh giới của các ngành. And so Mr. Kim and I will be the host for today's event. Mr. Kim first received his architecture training at the University of Architecture in Ho Chi Minh City, Vietnam. He is Master of Architecture alum and studio lead and tutor at the University of Melbourne, Australia. Over the years, his interest drifted toward the question of knowledge, productions, and the apparatuses of scaffold, sustain and propagate such knowledge. Mr. Kim is pursuing the Master of Design Studies Narrative program at Harvard University Graduate School of Design. Anh Kim và tôi sẽ là người dẫn dắt sự kiện hôm nay. Anh Kim được đào tạo kiến trúc tại trường kiến trúc thành phố Hồ Chí Minh. Anh sau đó học và giảng dạy tại Đại học Melbourne, Úc. Qua nhiều năm, mối quan tâm của anh trôi chuyển các vấn đề của sự sáng tạo kiến trúc và các bộ máy nhằm kết khung, duy trì và lan truyền những kiến thức đó. Anh Kim đang theo chương trình thạc sĩ nghiên cứu thiết kế, lịch sử và lý luận tại trường sau đại học về thiết kế tại Đại học Harvard. And now, without further ado, không thể để các bạn đợi lâu nữa. Please welcome Fosco Lucarelli.
Thanks a lot for your very nice and thorough introduction. I would gladly share my presentation if it's possible. Let me try.
I think it is.
Okay, let me. Okay, just 1 second because I don't find it. There you go. Okay, I hope, is it visible?
Yeah, I can
Everyone?
see it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's looking good to me too.
All right, thanks a lot. So as you were saying, I'm an architect and a teacher and a curator, and together with my partner Mariabruna Fabrizi, we run a double practice. One which is more research oriented, which is called SOC Studio, which is a website, a visual atlas that I'm gonna introduce in a minute. And the other one is a more classically oriented architectural practice, which is called MICROCITIES, an architecture office. And these two practices have been converging in their objectives in the last 5 years, we can say. Through a series of works in the academic domain, but also in the research domain of the specific work we do for architectural exhibitions, in which we have been both curators and exhibition designers. This is the main topic of this presentation that I'm gonna give you, and in which I'm gonna begin with the presentation of this of the website first, which is a work that we started when we were still students. Nowadays, many years ago. SOX is a website in which we feature a series of topics of different genres, from art-related information, architecture-related information, media, technology, science, and we use architectural knowledge to see these other domains, to see the architectural inside other domains. The on page of this website show itself like this: is a series of posts, very different in nature. Somehow this homepage deals with the idea of exquisite corpse in a way. One topic is completely unrelated to the following one. They are the choice of these topics comes from our ongoing interest in specific periods of time. There are no threads. There's a strong editorial freedom. It's basically the two of us, Mariabruna and I, that wrote most of the post or these posts. But over time, after we reach a sort of critical mass of numbers of posts in this website, we started working on a second step, a second layer for this website, which is the so-called visual atlas, which is a series of all these posts put in a sort of a grid, which somehow relates to the idea of the internet as a all-encompassing visual atlas, in which we can find and investigate and reveal affinities and relations in between all the posts that we produced over time. So it's a way to start connecting one of the posts to another in a sort of a journey, in a sort of a walk across a territory, which is somehow the subtitle of this website. So a journey, the idea of movement across a territory of imagination, a territory which is non-linear in the sense that is not related chronologically from one topic to another, but a territory nonetheless. And of course, when we talk about visual atlases in general, we cannot not talk to the main ancestor of the modern take on visual atlas, which is the Mnemosine Atlas by Aby Warburg, in which the invention of the new technology, photography, allowed the historian, the very renowned historian, to produce a new historiography of art by underlying these affinities and these relationships that are across centuries of artistic production, and to produce a series of topics. And of course, topics, and this is the visual atlas as it presents in SOCS. But topics is also a third layer in our website. It's a way of affirming the fact that notwithstanding the relative freedom that we try to preserve over the years in the way we write and collect information about different works, there are some strong qualities in between the different posts that we do, qualities that we can catalog as topics, which are themes related to architectural representation or architectural matter, or technological attributes, or historical narratives, but topics which are not classically academic in their nature. So a list of them can go from the dysfunctional plans that we in which somehow we put together a series of architectural and artistic works that are showing architectural plans one way or another, and architectural plans that are not functionally oriented, but somehow produce a distortion in the functioning of society. But we also have, as I already told you, problems of representation, especially in axonometry representation, and also problems of photographic relation to time. So also the topics are really different in nature, but somehow are stratified in order to find a way of connecting the dots together in this website. But over time, we've been asked a lot to produce some kind of materialization of our work, or our digital work. Many friends and colleagues ask us to produce a SOCS book, somehow the SOCS counterpart in a classical format of the book, and we most of the times we somehow decided not to do that, because a classical book would be completely against the nature of this never-ending production that we do since many years in SOCS. But we did something different in a way, in this way of materialization on the digital content, and it's pretty much what I'm gonna present to you, the way how we present the digital work in non-digital formats, the spatial format. So the first time that we did that was in 2016 for a collateral event in the Venice Biennale. The curators of this collateral event asked us to produce, then again, some kind of a translation of this digital atlas in a kind of non-digital context. And so we worked in borrowing some kind of fluxes, fluxes as in the art movement approach. We produced a game in a format of a deck of playing cards. Each one of these cards contained an image and a text, and each one of these cards were related to an article that we produced in SOCS. And the idea was that every observer, the audience could retrieve these cards and put the contents together in order to produce relationship in the topics, and to produce new meaning in the posts that we were presenting now in a paper format. So this a portable museum was somehow a new possibility of producing knowledge by the juxtaposition of very heterogeneous content. Another time was in 2017 at the Frac Center. Frac Centers are in France archives of arts and architecture, especially the Orléans Prague Center is related to a lot of radical 1960s, 70s, and 80s architecture. It's a beautiful center. And every 2 years, they have a biennale, like in Venice. And in 2017, we were invited to produce something. So there was not so much a specific request that time. And we produced this sort of sculpture, which is for us a way of looking at the content in this FRAC archive, somehow translating that content into abstract forms, content that was related to architectural knowledge, as in problems of representations, problems of underlying structures, or problems of architectural theory. So each one of these problems, these matters, were transformed by us into one element of this 4x4 grid. And there is one of these is the room within a room. Another one is related to the grid, as in an underlying framework for architecture. Other were related to architectural elements, the window, the stairs, and so on, so on. And this is another form of producing some kind of an urban landscape. So again, this idea of a territory out of the territory of the theory of architecture and of imagination. So it's a critical landscape of a possible urban representation of architectural knowledge. But maybe the first important occasion for us to work in as curators for an exhibition, apart from some other minor ones that we did earlier, was in the occasion of the Lisbon Architecture Triennale in 2016, when we've been invited by the two directors at the time, Diogo Seixas Lopes and André Tavares, to curate the content of this edition, of the most important of the three main exhibitions of this Triennale, 2016 Triennale, which was called The Form of Form by the same Diogo Seixas Lopes, an architect and curator and theorist. There was also a friend, and The Form of Form is a kind of an enigmatic, very fascinating title, because it's ambiguous, it's obscure, it's not easy to understand what it meant for this title. And neither did he explain completely explicitly to us. So we started working on a way of translating our own atlas, and to use the space that wasn't existing at the beginning of our work, the space of a series of pavilions that were conceived and realized by three different architecture offices, which were Johnston Markley from the USA, Office Kesten Guest David van Severen from Belgium, and an architect from Portugal called Nuno Brandão Costa. These three architects sort of produced as a kind of, again, an exquisite corpse out of the investigation of their own past built and unbuilt architecture. Basically, it was a game, again, maybe some kind of Fluxus game also among themselves. They decided to choose three rooms, three architectural spaces from the productions of the other architects, and one from their own. Spaces that weren't just fragments somehow of their own production. And all these productions were reproduced eventually at the scale 1:1 outside of the main museum that was supposed at the beginning to host the exhibition, and they decided not to, sorry. So they were reproduced 1:1 in the form of plasterboard with a steel structure, without any kind of ornamentation, without any kind of color, without any kind of materiality. They decided to reproduce these pavilions in order to start some kind of discourse over form and authoriality. And these pavilions were put together in this sort of Frankenstein final form that followed many steps. And so for us, it was kind of complex and interesting to work on an exhibition in pavilions that were produced at the same time in a final form that wasn't realized at the very end of our process. And what we did is to to find ways to put content in this kind of a changing landscape and find a way to relate to this architectural Frankenstein. So we choose content from socks, this time from different time period and regions of the world. And in form, for the first time, we identified affinities in the creation of the built environment, highlighting what remains constant and what changes. So we selected different themes from socks, and these themes became physical clusters in the exhibition. We asked ourselves, what will we keep from the digital? What do we lose? What do we gain when we translate this content from the digital realm into the physical one? And for us, one of the a priori approaches is the possibility of entering the exhibition from different entry points, and to hence produce as many as possible of visitors to the content itself, as many as possible different exhibitions. And this is something that we somehow borrowed from the digital realm. You can enter socks from very different entry points, from a post linked somewhere else, from the homepage, from the atlas, and everyone has a different kind of visits to the content of socks. Anyone can produce this kind of walk into this digital territory. So we wanted to preserve that in this exhibition. And how did we work with the content itself? I'm going to show you one example with 3 images. We worked with formal and conceptual affinities. So for moving from one image to another. So we could have, for example, the plan of Cataluyuk, which is the one that I'm showing you, one of the earliest human settlement composed by inhabitable cells, that a city without streets, in which you could enter each one of the cells from the roof. So a city without infrastructure. And then we associated to that this other image, for example. So nothing to do chronologically, nothing to do somehow architecturally from a purely theoretical entry point of architecture. This agricultural city by Kisho Kurokawa, an unbuilt project by the very famous metabolist Japanese architect, produced in 1961. So a kind of a city over a big machine related to agricultural work. Again, there's this idea of the cells, this idea of variating the ways of inhabiting this megastructure. And all of this can be connected to something which is not even architectural per se, like the very known image for incomplete open cubes by conceptual artist Saul DeWitt, produced in 1974, which is a work, of course, related to the designing of a cube by means of all the variations in the association of edges of the cube. So, of course, what you can ask yourself, what do these 3 works have in common? Why do we associate them? This is a reflection of one of the aspects of form, which is the possibilities of replicating, associating, and variating form. So the angle of repetition and variation is what puts all these works together. That's why the formal affinities is what puts all this work together. So it's some kind of a non-academic way of presenting matters of form, and an academic way of reflecting about some characteristics in form. And for us, all through this lecture, I'm going to show you also a series of thinkers, curators, or intellectuals that somehow inspired us and guided us over the process of designing and conceiving an exhibition and all these works, or the content of the exhibition. One of them was Lucy Lippard, the very important theorist of art and curator, especially this series of exhibitions that she curated in the 1970s called the Number Shows. exhibitions of conceptual art, in which basically what is shown is a series of Xerox copies of works, as in text, images, and so on, and exhibitions that could be brought to the actual museum, actual art center by means of a suitcase. So the material value of the works was known, and the conceptual value of the work was immense, of course. So we wanted to preserve this idea of producing an exhibition with almost nothing, just reproductions, just content, and without almost their material value, their original material value. And this exhibition shows itself as this. So you can see the plasterboard, the white surfaces, and from this image also the actual structure that was exposed on the other side. Our exhibition is some kind of a line of reproductions of images in a A3 format, a line which is an horizon, the height of the eyes of the observers and the public. Somehow is a way of having a counterpart to this immense fragmentation of the architectural space, having preserved something very simple, this eye, this line that this line of images that somehow translated into objects as well. So specific works were produced as model reproduction, or cartographies, or maps, or even furniture. And what is important in this line is that, since all the reproductions are at the same height, you could somehow optically relate the images in the foreground to the images in the background. Somehow having this idea of interlinking, which is so classically related to the internet, which is somehow translated here in a visual way. And for the first time, we also translated this digital content into a book, which is a catalog this time. And we did that for every exhibition that we produced. So I'm going to show you just a series of pages. These are reproductions of the works, and it's important to us that the book is not just a catalog, but it's also a way of expanding the knowledge of the exhibition in another format. These are just some pages from the catalog. So at the end of the first Lisbon Triennale that we worked on, we were thinking, yes, it's a pity we worked for 3 years producing this exhibition. It will be maybe the last time we're gonna meet all the people that we met in Lisbon. And then we did it again, because this time we weren't invited, but we participated with a group of colleagues from the architectural school that we teach in. We responded to the call for project for the new exhibition, and we won this exhibition. We won this call with a proposal that was called the Poetics of Reason. So this time, we worked on one of the exhibitions of this edition of the Lisbon Triennale, and we worked on the idea of reason. What are the different ways reason guides architecture? Which are its limits? Which are its politics? Which are its ways of expressing itself? And how reason helps communicating the discipline values themselves to the general audience today. Our exhibition is called Inner Space, and it's about the construction of imagination. How does imagination relates somehow with reason? We worked as content curators, but for the first time, worked also as exhibition designers and authors of the already published essay. So we moved from different media again, from the more theoretical content to the actual implementation of this content to an exhibition, and also to the translation into an essay of that. And again, for another time, we refer to the work of one of these guides, these intellectual authors, architects or artists, or so on, that somehow allow us to have some kind of a path, a theoretical path to produce the different work in different times. And in this in this fragment from a very interesting interview to Ballard, what he's saying is that the surrealist artists could create landscapes that would be in correspondence with their own minds. And also that doing this particular work, this production out of their minds, they could find this sort of middle ground between the psyche, their own psyche, and the outer world of reality. And James Ballard, of course, I don't think I need to introduce him, but he was a very, very important science fiction writer and theorist of contemporary age. Well, he called this some kind of middle ground as inner space. So this kind of theoretical immaterial space that is in between the psyche of the author, the psyche of the architect, the psyche of the surrealist painters, and their outdoor reality, the tangible reality. So what we wanted to do with this exhibition was to try and explore this inner space, to materialize this inner space, to materialize the imagination of architecture producers and artistic producers, this inner space in between the mind and the external space. We worked in two parallel ways. On one sense, we identified a series of works that were physical representation of the inner states of mind, of mental faculties, and especially imagination. On another, we selected works ranging from architectural projects, works of art, etc., that could be understood as extensions of inner psychic processes with a specific emphasis on imagination again. So imagine this idea of specialization of imagination was central in this exhibition and guided us, maybe for the first time, into this particular interest that we have of specializing mental faculties. So basically, the process starts from imagination seen as an immersive territory, and a territory which can be experienced, which can be crossed, which can be inhabited, and also which can be even constructed itself, which is not something just spontaneous, as used to be considered up to the Romantic period. So we opened the exhibition with a series of cartographies, with a series of maps, which are maps of interior processes, interior states of minds, like this one by British artist Grayson Perry, which looks like a kind of pre-modern city with these walls and so on, with all these plazas and the streets and representations of buildings and also of like territorial items, features like the river and so on. But in fact, it's more a depiction of the artist's own states of mind, the artist's own brain, with neighborhoods of anxiety, streets of stress, and and so on and so on. Each one of these neighborhoods related to a different state of mind of the artist, and this work called the Map of Days, because it talks about a movement across these inner states of minds. It's like a week of the brain of the artist represented as a city. So it's a very fascinating start for our exhibition. But then the exhibition follows with two different movements related to the production and specialization of imagination. One which is related more to the collective imagination, and one related to the individual imagination. In the collective one, we identified two archetypes which could produce infinite variations over time. The architects which were the enclosure on one side and the tower, and specifically the Tower of Babel, on the other side. And to understand this too, we feature a series of figures which could embody the different moments of the exhibition. The map, of course, in the first part, the cartography in the first part that I just showed you, and then the cabinet in the next one, the cabinet related to the problem of the collective imagination. The cabinet is this structure, which is 11 meters height, that we designed and produced for this exhibition in a very narrow space of the museum that we worked on. And it's pretty much an exhibition within the exhibition. This is composed of different parts. The lower part is what we could associate to a studiolo, so a place that was used basically by scholars in the medieval times and then in the Renaissance times, a place to focus, a place to translate the Bible. Also, the scholars were monks and theologians, like the very famous Saint Jerome, depicted by Antonello da Messina. The studiolos were not just places in which produce intellectual works, but also were some kind of rooms, furnitures, and also containers for the very objects that were used by the scholars to produce their own imaginative works. So basically, we feature in the lower stages of this big cabinet a series of objects that were related to collective imagination, and the upper you went, the more this cabinet somehow narrows itself, including mostly visual content, mostly images of different themes, and it becomes some kind of cabinet of curiosities itself, which is itself one attempt to visualize physically the products of collective imagination architecture. This imagination, yes, related to different kinds of topics, the relationship of architecture with nature, with geometrical features, with colors, proportions, and shapes. And going the upper part, you would see just images, which were related in the end with the enclosure itself and this Tower of Babel, the two archetypes that for us somehow embodied the beginning, let's say, of any work of architecture in any form. All these images, I'm going back to this photo, all these images were featured coming from the public realm, no copyright, and they represent what make architecture as a collective, common and shareable knowledge. It's pretty much also a kind of a political take on this problem of collective imagination for us. The second movement in the exhibition is what I already defined as problems related to individual imagination. So how imagination works for specific artists and architects, how individual architects would find systems and approaches to construct, organize, and visualize their own inner universe. So for this second part, we studied the collection of images and objects of three specific architects. I'm only showing one of them. We worked with the archive of Aldo van Eyck, Dutch 1950s to 1980s architect. Not so much the archive of his projects, but his archive of images, his collections of visual features from magazines to travel photos to works of art, for example, to Brancusi specifically in this photo, to photos he took himself in Italian cities, or photos of his travels and his studies to the Dogon population in Africa. So the pre-modern society that for himself was a very important reference for his works. And also the way that all this visual universe somehow translated into some kind of visual manifesto for Aldo van Eyck, which was called the Otterlo Circles, Otterlo being the particular conference meeting that this work was produced for. And in these Otterlo Circles, he somehow, yes, gave a manifesto of the necessities of contemporary architecture, how vernacular architecture could somehow be put in connection to classical architecture and modern architecture, represented here by a series of plans and also axonometries of different moments of architecture. So how architecture could be unified in his ongoing knowledge, from the spontaneous production to the most intellectual production of mankind. And in this way, what is produced by us architects, would be produced with a political movement for us as society, for us as people working and living in contemporary society. And what interested us was to somehow materialize this movement, and to materialize with the second installation, the second exhibition within the exhibition that we produced specifically for inner space, which we called this time Denkraum, delving this term from another figure that will be important for us. Now I'm gonna show you also in this lecture, which is Aby Warburg again. The Denkraum is a machine for thinking, in a way, and machine for producing knowledge. And in this particular take, we produce a machine for seeing, a visual machine to somehow materialize metaphorically the production from the brain into the outside world. So it's pretty much a kind of a circular room in which you would enter, and that would be completely obscure, completely dark. Inside, you would see reproductions of this visual universe, this collection of images, the collections of reference and of each one of these three architects, the other two being Sullivan and Lina Bobardi. And from inside this visual machine, you would see outside, you would see the walls outside, in which the actual plans or other representations of the actual architectures of each one of these architects could be seen. So basically, from inside, you would see the projection outside of these mental activities, of this mental work that were done in the brain of the architect. So basically, you would be in between these two realms, the mental realm of inside the brain to the outside realm. You would be somehow suspended in this inner space that I've been talking about, like being in the architect's mind during the imaginative process. Another moment of this exhibition is what we call the sector of the extended mind. The extended mind is its content from the work of Andy Clark and David Chalmers, two cognitive scientists, which demonstrated how cognitive functions do not only take place in the mind, within the mind, but also in interaction with the environment, with the tools, with the media that we use every day, and also with architecture. This is something that also happened in the Aby Warburg's library and studio, let's say, where he would recompose the arrangement of the images in the Mnemosyne Atlas, so that I've been showing you in just two plates, and here we can see some other of them. He would move around the space, and he would move around the images. And so basically the space is some kind of, it is in some kind of interaction with its imaginative faculties. But what we see here is not just the Mnemosyne Atlas, we also see the actual library of the historian and theorist. And the same library is some kind of extension of his own mental faculty. Why is that? It's because all the books weren't classified by some kind of scientific systems, scientific codes, like in the Dewey system that we still use in our everyday libraries. The books were somehow associated with what was called by Aby Warburg himself the law of the good neighbor. So you could, just to give you an example, you would have a book on, I don't know, Renaissance painting to a book of entomology, because what Aby Warburg would wanted to associate and wanted to explore is the idea of, I don't know, animals in a Renaissance painting. I don't know, I'm just imagining, I'm not saying, I'm not giving an actual example. But what is important is that by associating two books, you will produce new content, new topics, new ways of creating knowledge, in the same way as you would do for the actual plates of the Mnemosyne Atlas. So The way mental faculties and actual imaginative production is related to the spaces in which this work was done was explored through a series of models that we asked some students from Rotterdam to realize from actual artistic studios of Jackson Pollock, for example, to places or Francis Bacon, to places for representing say all the knowledge in the world, like in the case of Giulio Camillo's memory theater, reproduced here in this image. The memory theaters for this Renaissance polymath, theorist, poet, some kind of representation of the collected world knowledge at the time, under the form of the Vitruvian theater, but reversed in its functioning. Whereas the Vitruvian theater was the most perfect representation of the theater for Roman times, which you would have the stage with the actors, of course, and the steps with the audience. Here you would have just one person at the center of the stage, one person which is the observer, the fruiter of the knowledge. They would look to the steps, and each one of these steps represents topics of the knowledge at the time. Of course, knowledge at the time was related to a series of symbolic values. So the number of steps, the number of topics, the number of sectors in this theater would relate to the actual all-encompassing cosmology of Giulio Camillo. And all cosmology, of course, was related to theologic values at this time. More recently, we would have something similar in the Mundaneum, in this kind of Wikipedia of the early 20th century, a place in which you could access all the knowledge in the world by a series, of technological approaches that you could have translated into spaces, rooms, and also devices in form of plates and furnitures. Of course, it wasn't ever really realized, but what is interesting for us is that the actual configuration of the space, the actual form of the space, is related to the actual content that it contains. Other sector of our exhibition relates to what we do more specifically in SOGS, so as to find architectural content in other disciplines, in other domains, as in photography, as in video game production. Also here, what you can see is comic book art. So how the architectural knowledge reflects and finds echoes in other domains. And this is again our book that we produced related to this exhibition. And again, it's one of this image you can see one of our references for the Studiolo and the very famous Studiolo San Jerome in his study, painted by the great Italian painter Antonello da Messina. Then going on in our investigation of another stage in this question of the spatialization of cognitive processes was an exhibition that we opened in 2021, end of 2021 up to 2022 in Lausanne, in the gallery of the Polytechnic Institute of Architecture in Lausanne. Which we were commissioned as curators and again exhibition designers for the display of a research on the historical role of architecture in the organization, representation, and communication of information and knowledge. So we started with imagination with form, basically at the beginning, then with imagination, and now we worked with knowledge, or better say, how information becomes knowledge. For For this exhibition, we started with also from an observation that we collectively spend a lot of time in the digital realm, in the digital space, what we used to call digital space, but the very spatial nature, spatial as in space, of course, nature of the digital is almost absent. The digital being almost completely flattened in a bidimensional surface. The bidimensional surface of the screens of our laptops, of our smartphones, or our tablets again. So there's no so much space in the digital space. Also, we began our work from a series of observations on paradoxes that are related to the digital realms. One, when we talk about information, especially after the introduction of computers, tablets, and smartphones, we always talk about dematerialization of information, something with no matter, something with no tangible characteristics. So what we wanted to do is to, on the contrary, to imagine a form related to information, a spatial and physical substance, or in any case, something related to the architectural, in order to convey this idea of information. Second observation is that when nowadays we talk about the transmission of information in the digital age, we always refer to a sort of breakup from a previous condition and a new digital condition. Actually, this exhibition was opened during some kind of dramatic process that the Polytechnic Institute in Lausanne underwent when the chair of architectural history got retreated in a way, the great historian Roberto Gargiani, and a new kind of debate was opened to which kind of chair would be necessary in an architectural school nowadays, and what was the role of the digital turn, what was called the digital turn, as should we still teach the kind of classical architectural canon, or should we talk about the contemporary condition, which is the digital condition, according to the fosterers of this debate. So what we wanted to somehow criticize, to question this idea that the digital turn, the digital is something that we do not reject at all. Me and Mariabruna, of course, we work in the digital realm since when we were students. We owe so much to that, but we believe that architecture didn't undergo a very breakup from what happened before the digital and to what is the digital condition. We always try to see history from the angle of permanence, from the angle of finding traces of the digital turn already in the remote history of architecture and in general of human production. Also because architecture, by analogy, has always relied with modes of organization of thought and information in a logical way, which is something that applies so much to the digital sphere. Third aspect, and last one, is that digital culture historically needed to refer to architectural and spatial metaphors to explain its abstract functioning to the general audience, and to share concepts which couldn't be expressed visually. The digital realm always talked about windows, desktops, to backdoors, for example. So to allow the general public to understand the function in the way of using the digital by means of spatial and metaphors and also architectural metaphors. The windows being, of course, in the computer, I don't have to show you what it is. The windows being some kind of interface in between what you see and the actual ways of using what is stored in the computer. So we tried conversely to adopt to appropriate terms from the digital culture, to look at them through the eyes of architects and see how you can use them conceptually. And then I'm going to show you how we did that, although you can see again already in the title what we wanted to do. But before talking about information seen from the eyes of architects, we needed to to give some kind of definition to information, which isn't an easy task at all. For us, information happens as a sort of metaphorical processing, starting with the storing or raw data, data without meaning per se, through the moments in which the data gets organized, structured, put in logical sequences to eventually become a form of knowledge. So it's some kind of dialectical process for us. Information is a dialectical process in which data becomes eventually knowledge. That database network interface are these three figures that we appropriated from the digital realm. And for us, they represent metaphorically three ways of processing information and constructing spatial logics. Database for storing, network for interconnecting, and interface for communicating. I'm going to show you a little bit more what we intend with that. But again, for this exhibition, we needed to refer to some kind of figure, historical figure, that could guide us in this process, in a way, in the process of designing and conceiving this exhibition. And this time, we refer to the work of Ramon Llull, a Spanish medieval polymath poet, philosopher, theologian, late medieval poet, but in a way a figure that somehow could be understood as some sort of early Renaissance figure, despite the fact that he lived in the 14th century, the beginning of 13th century. Ramon Llull produced, among other works and essays, the Ars Magna, a book which made use of a series of images, like this one here, a series of representations, a series of diagrams, of representations of devices that he himself produced out of paper, devices that could be, they could rotate. Each one of these circles could rotate from the center, and devices that could associate different concepts one to another to produce new knowledge. So in a way, these devices are actually considered as ancestors of digital logics and even of artificial intelligence logics, in a way that the technological machine could somehow produce consciously cognitive processes outside of the mind, exactly as in contemporary artificial intelligence machines. Furthermore, for us, what is interesting in these machines is that, in this particular diagram, for example, is that they contain geometrical thought. They have a spatial nature, a spatial identity. They are made by lines, and these lines could be understood as walls. And all these machines could be considered as, also as architectural plans, and they also could be considered as something associated to architectural logics. Is this first image that allows us to let these two worlds, the digital realm of information and the architectural realm, to communicate. The exhibition design itself is a crucial way to express and communicate the content, and we decided to work on some kind of combinatory exhibition, like in the previous diagram by Ramon Llull. In this exhibition, there is no hierarchy in the content, nor a predefined path, exactly as we did with the form of form exhibition. Each visitor can find its own way of visiting the exhibition through different paths, ways of corresponding visually, creating different relations among the subjects in order to produce new subjects itself. To do this, we decided to adopt another figure by Ramon Llull, which is this one, which is called figura plena, which is a diagram obtained by the superimposition of three basic geometric figures, which is the equilateral triangle, the circle, and the square. And the superposition is of three figures having the same surface, the same area, let's say, and having also sharing the same center. These three figures can be found in other essays on geometry by Ramon Llull, and These essays, of course, are related to ways of defining abstractly and conceptually and metaphorically the known universe of with time, and of course the knowledge related to the whole universe as a series of concepts that can be translated into geometrical figures that could go from the most the inner, the most smaller fragment to the whole universe, so representing the divinity in at work in constructing the universe. And what we wanted to do too was to reuse these three figures, the geometrical shape of the equilateral triangle, the circle, and the square, in order to produce fragments that could be decomposed and recomposed all the time in the form of furnitures. And this is the actual plan of the exhibition, which is for us very fascinating. It was for us some kind of a alien alphabet in a way. But what it is that each one of these three figures, the square, the circle, and the equilateral triangle, were associated to one of these three figures, the database, the network, and the interface. So the circle will be associated to the database, because even if you look the database on Google, you would find the database is always associated to some kind of cylinder container. So the section is the circle. The network would be for us the triangle, because the triangle is what connects the three different points. And the square would be associated to the idea of the interface, the square being, the window, but also the screen of a laptop or a computer. So there are metaphors in act here, and all these figures would be erected in, let's say, in 3D furnitures, which were displayers, which were also associated to the ways in which we somehow use and display information, from the bookshelf to the table, etc. And again, going back to here, you would find different topics again there, from physical archives in architecture to ancient libraries, to problems of information spatialized, to digital realms as places of memories, to the windows, a specific topic on the windows itself, to the facade of architecture as some kind of interfaces, etc. So there are very different topics related to how in architecture you can find somehow problems of digital information and problems of information in general. Some photos from this exhibition. So you would find visual contents, but also models. And all these elements, we call them totems. And again, you would find relationships between one and the other one. And each one of the observers could find different paths across all these totems. And again, we produced a book for this exhibition, which was also a reflection on this recombinatory nature of the exhibition. This book presents each one of these content that we featured in the exhibition as some kind of very scattered information. So it's not so much a catalog, it's not so much an essay, it's something ambiguously in between all that. And we worked with a very nice graphic design studio in Paris called Spassky Fischer, that were very involved in the actual translation of this process of thought that we used in the exhibition to produce something else, something materialized but differently as this book. And just to conclude my presentation, I'm gonna show you the beginning of a new work that we did, or basically, no, the end of one phase of our work and the beginning of another one, which is again on materialization and spatialization of mental faculties. But in this particular work, we focused on this idea of image schemas. And for doing that, we refer to the work of Mark Johnson, a philosopher and cognitive scientist, who introduced the mere idea, the mere concept of image schema in his essay, The Body in the Mind. What is the image schema? Is a concept which connects our sensory motor system, our functioning movement, say, of the body, with our capacity of creating abstract thoughts. Basically, what is Mark Johnson said in this book is that our ability to think in abstract ways comes from our early interaction with space. For example, moving in a linear way. When we were toddlers, for example, we moved in a linear way from one point to another. Let us develop the capacity of moving from one concept to another in a thought. Or many of our abilities of thinking in abstract ways comes from our physical movement and interaction with space. I can give you another example from there. The idea that time is linear, so that we have a before and after, is a translation from our experience of having a before and after in space. So we encounter something in space before, and then we encounter something else in space after. And this gives us the idea, which is so natural in ourselves, that time progresses linearly. And this is very important. And this somehow put the basis in our fourth chapter in our work, which is an evolution of these matters of specialization and relationship in between mind and space, also including the influence that space has into the mind and the ways mental faculties and processes have a translation and correspondence into space. So we wanted to focus on this idea of the image schema, the relationship between an image schema and architecture. And the first work that we did in this new chapter of our research is a very small installation in a collective exhibition in the Kunstbibliothek Zitterberg, in this library of arts in St. Gallen in Switzerland, which is a library, but it's also a center of art, and it's some kind of a translation itself in the library of Abbey Warburg, because in this St. Gallen library they don't have any kind of classifications of the books they have there, but they somehow follows this law of good neighbor again. Only that they do that in a digital way. They have a sensor that scans all the positions of the books, which is always varying according to the uses of the public. They use the book and they put in the shelves again. So they want to scan the possible configurations of the book in order to analyze the way the associations of books themselves can give new topics, new knowledge. So it's a kind of a new ways of translating Abbey Warburg processes of thought in a collective way by means of the digital realm. But in any case, what we did for this exhibition, an exhibition that was related to the idea of language, was to design some kind of representation of image schemas as logos. I can show you one of the 3 plates here. To associate one image schema to an example of concrete poetry, to a Renaissance plan or section. So we wanted to translate, for example, idea of containment. So the idea that something is contained in a container, to a concrete poem. You may know that concrete poetry is a form of poetry in which equal importance is given to word, but also word as in concept, let's say, but also in the ways the words themselves form a form in a way, form the shape, have a kind of a translation into space. And we wanted to give also this idea of containment in a plan for an ideal city from the Renaissance. So you can see somehow that for us, architecture contains in itself, in the ways it's represented and functions spatially, an idea of image schema, so an idea of abstract thinking. We have other examples here. We have the line represented by a path, and here another concrete poem, and the Garden of Belvedere by Bramante in its plan, or the idea of movement by the arrow of the image schema that somehow is echoed by the arrow in this concrete poem, and the Uffizi gallery, which allows you to enhance this idea of movement, etc. We have other ones, the ideas of verticality, Guillaume Apollinaire work with rain, and a tower from Renaissance, and again, So what we wanted to do is to somehow saying that the way we start thinking is somehow echoed in architecture itself, some way or another, in the way we design buildings. And basically, I said this is the beginning of another chapter. What we are doing right now in a new publication that is gonna be financed and sponsored by a school that I taught 1 year in Chicago, the USC school in Chicago, and the Grant Foundation is a work in which we somehow do the same thing. We associate concept in image schemas to architecture, but we don't want to rely on existing content from the history of architecture. We want to design these very projects. So we produce some kind of a meta projects, meta designs out of this idea of the relationship between mental faculties again and architecture. And this is pretty much an ongoing work that I don't have any image to show you, but this is pretty much the end of my presentation today. And these are other images from the St. Gallen exhibition. Thanks a lot.
Wow. Thank you, Fosco. This is actually amazing, and also like congratulations on receiving the funding for your future project. I'm actually pretty excited to see that. What would be the outcome of that one? There's actually a lot of information to cover here. But
so
maybe
it's very
perhaps
dense.
but then maybe perhaps people I'm just going to buy some time for the audience to ask a question, but I guess what I'm trying to do right now is that maybe point back to the title of the talk that you just did. It was the form of information. I mean, this is actually quite interesting because when Triet and I try to translate the title of your of the talk into Vietnamese, it's so very interesting because form is a very difficult word to translate, and also at the same time of course in information there's also form, whether that it's so very kind of interesting relationship. But then also I kind of want to expand this relationship between form and information, and kind of perhaps point back to a very interesting association between architecture and the book. It's been an ongoing fascination between it, you got Catameta Quincy, also talk about the idea by Rome as this open book. And of course, Victor Hugo said that oh, the book will kill the architecture, which is kind of a very interesting kind of relationship. But what I can see also in your project is this idea by how form is architecture, and then information is the book, which is this kind of matching and mapping the relationship to exchange to one another. Of course, I think in your case, you in a lot of what you say that it's not exactly a book; it's more like an atlas, which is a very different medium in itself. So my question here is this kind of this kind of transition between one medium to the next, and especially this is fascinating because and perhaps point back to what Victor Hugo said about the book will kill architecture, because I find that this is something quite important here, because one thing one thing is that, you know, like information has the capacity to actually move across, you know, like in a much faster distance, but further distance at a faster pace compared to like architecture. So you're like, it's a question about like, you know, when one medium turn into the others, you know, what been lost, what been kind of like there. You kind of like touch upon that a little bit, but you know, I'm just kind of like curious in like your process in this, because you know, like, it's a very fascinating between, you know, like this association between, you know, like materialization, dematerialization, but then also at the same time, you're like formalization versus, you know, like no form, or you know, like form in a different way.
No, thank you for this very interesting question. It's very true that I could have titled this lecture as translation or lost in translation also, in the way that, of course, what we do and what we are very interested in is how, on one side, you know, the work that we produce on socks is translated, and when it's materialized in some forms or another in the bidimensional space of the book, or or the essays itself, to the material space, which is also very metaphorically related to the content itself. And of course, there's a lot of thought on what is lost during this process of translation, and there's a lot, of course. What I told you about at the beginning, that, you know, we've been asked at the beginning to produce a book of socks, or a book of this visual atlas, and we always refuse to do that, because you would lose maybe too much in this idea of never-ending questioning the contemporary production. It would, you know, in this way, it would have needed some kind of structuring, some kind of hierarchy, which is something that we do not have in socks itself. So instead, we wanted to do books when we wanted to give cues to the exhibitions that we did, and we wanted not so much to translate socks per se, but we wanted to translate a specific topic that we feature in the exhibition itself. So on one side is this translation from one medium to another, but in a way, we're also interested in this, what we can call translation again, from the actual thinking that we do in our brains, and, you know, in this inner space that Ballard was so interested in, to the outer reality, which is another form of translation in a way, or the ways in which our bodily movement, our being in the space by having and being a body, somehow allows us to think in itself. So it's another kind of translation, and it's very interesting to us. So the way this movement across all these different realms. Of course, there's another thinker that all of us are very interested on. It used to be Umberto Eco, that produced a work on the activity of translating. And what is interesting is, again, is what you lose and what you gain, because translation is saying the same thing but in a different way. And we end up saying that the most important language is not so much English or Chinese or whatever language is more diffused, or Spanish is more diffused in the world, but it's this translation language. So it's this activity of being in between one language and the another, you know, and what is and the actual book is always suspended in these two different realms. Of course, the original book is supposed to be the one that, you know, the original language is the one that the author writes in. But what is interesting is that we acquire universal knowledge by translating original work. So it's interpretations all the time. So yes, you're right. And to go back to the actual title, The Form of Information, and what we're also interested in is that both form and information, and they're more or less related, of course, but are also related in this kind of obscure way, some kind of ambiguous way. Form is a very ambiguous word, and it requires many different kind of characteristics and qualities in different languages. For example, I come from Italy. We have forma in Italian, but we don't have the difference in between form and shape that you would have in English. again. And also in English, you have the current English, the common, the vulgar, let's say, ways of using, the informal way of using language. But then the actual problem of defining the difference in between form and shape is something that has interested many theorists in actual the design field, or the philosophical field itself, because it's not something that is so clear. Let's say there's a very interesting work on that in an article published by Bob Somol in Content by Rem Koolhaas, which somehow tried to define the difference in between form and shape, and how contemporary architecture should refer more to shape than form. But then there's also the answer to that article by Pier Vittorio Aureli more recently. So there's a lot of, so what is form is something much more charged with conceptual features, whereas shape is something more easy to translate. We don't know exactly, so it's open to interpretation. And again, information is also a little bit like that. We use this word information in our daily life very easily, very informally, very casually. But information is something very difficult to explain. And with that, we somehow decide to give this idea to connecting information to knowledge, and in this way to connect the term information to the actual work that we do on the mental faculties. Because knowledge, the production of knowledge is one of the most important human mental faculties. So the production of knowledge out of information, and also the production of information out of the structuring in sequences, logical sequences of raw data, is something also we do in the lab. So all this, we consider all these translations as metaphorical processes, difficult to explain in a rational way, but part of our work as producers, both in a theory, in written theory, or in art, on architecture, in your case, in design activities.
Yeah.
I don't know if I answered your question properly, but
I mean, it wasn't really it wasn't really a question to begin with. So
it was very fast.
But I guess also, this is where it's kind of interesting, because and I think I see this through a lot of your work, is this idea of at the moment, and especially I'm going to bring this back to the idea of cartography, and also the cabinet of curiosity, because I think these two form of materialized information, or it's maybe not really materialized information, it's more it's actually talk about the act of translation. It's literally the act of translation kind of manifesting that. I think it's kind of interesting, because a lot of people tend to we have the tendency to equate the map as oh, it's an image of reality, which is actually not. The map is always is in fact is a very particular way of seeing the world, and sometimes there's supposed there's always the mismatch between the map and the reality, and and at the same with the cabinet of curiosity, because cabinet of curiosity also from especially in the Renaissance, is meant to be almost a representation of the cosmological order of the world, whether that actually true or not, scientifically true or not, that is another matter. But it's it's sort of have present this act of translation in material form. And I think I think this is very interesting in and I can see this kind of go on in your work, and perhaps this kind of point back to another interest of mine personally, is the idea of exhibiting architecture, which I always find very fascinating, because it's almost it's a reflexive act of architecture. Architecture looking into itself by doing architecture. And this also kind of collapse within the idea of studio law, cabinet of curiosity, but also on photography itself. I'm just maybe this perhaps this question I don't have an answer for this question. This perhaps slightly a trick question, but I think this perhaps interesting to have just for the audience, because for the context of Vietnam, is that in Vietnam's practice still very much confined to this very I would call it orthodox architecture, which is you have a client, you come in to do a project and things like that. Your model practice is just especially focused on exhibitions, is a kind of an alternative model, but I'm just wondering whether like is there any like possibility of like translating this information, like this kind of like model practice within the realm of the exhibition to like like let's say more traditional realm, or perhaps that is not something that you're interested in.
Also, another very interesting question, very vast again, and it's very interesting how you associate in a way the problem of cartography to the problem of the early exhibition devices like the cabinet of curiosities. You associate these two in the way that somehow they're not representation, they're not reality, they're representation of reality, in which reality is somehow synthesized, reduced, put in an abstract way. Again, you would find another interesting essay, a small essay by Umberto Eco, talking about the map, this ideal map in which the map was at the one-to-one scale of the territory. Of course, the map, the real map needs to reduce reality in some kind of abstract form in different ways according to the scales. And in the sense, I would associate to the map the representations of architecture that you would use in your daily practices, like the plan, the section, the elevation, the tools of representation, the most classical tools of representation, that are again the same thing as a cartography in a way, because they do not represent architecture as in their final form. They represent aspects of architecture. No, they're like reduction of the complexity of architecture, something that can be somehow used for information, for translation, and so on. So, and that's pretty much how I wanted to connect these problems in a way to the problem of architectural exhibitions in an orthodox way, as we say, because usually you would enter an architectural exhibition of whatever architects, and what you would see generally is a series of models, a series of plans, a series of which is again something that happens. It's something very interesting, and we are pretty much interested in these ways of representing architecture itself. But it's a inherent problem of architecture per se, contrary to artistic practice and artistic exhibition, is that architecture is not representable in exhibition at this one-to-one form. So basically, there are many ways for architectural curators to represent architecture, but you will never represent architecture in a one-to-one form, because even if you produce an actual space, is more kind of a fragment, is more kind of an artistic presentation of architecture. Architecture is something which is very complex because its nature is related to the fact that they associate artistic orientations to very prosaic needs, let's say, very commonplaces needs. You would never represent architecture by just showing a representation of it. You would represent only the representation of it. You wouldn't represent it the way architecture can somehow configure lives, or how architecture is connected to society, to politics, to. So all this is very interesting, and our practice as let's say researchers on one side, and actually practicing architects in other side is pretty much trying to converge these two realms. The way we deal with clients. I mean, of course, in this exhibition, in this lecture, I haven't at all presented our work as architecture professor, which is also more orthodox, as you were saying. We have clients, private clients, that we produce, spaces to live in a way, basically. But what we wanted to do is to preserve a little bit this research and to let it converge into the actual work that we do for clients. And this is something very difficult to do, because whereas on the exhibitions we have a relative freedom in the way we both curate and design our work, of course, when we deal with clients, it's more when we need to respond to actual demands in a way. But in a way, the way that we studied the way we think and the relationship of that to space allow us to somehow conceive spaces that are explainable by this research in a way. And then this is something that we are doing with our latest clients for works that hopefully would be a reflection of all these theories. So we wanted to converge our curatorial design exhibition activities to our architecture practice and also to our teaching activities. Is our main goal in the end, to not let these activities as separate kind of domains.
Yeah. Oh, well, thank you very much, Fosco Lucarelli and Mr. Kim. We're running out of time, but can we have like one more question from the Q&A? It's from Mr. Leduc. Can if you want, I can let you take the mic. Leduc.
Okay. Can you hear me? All right. Okay. I can
Sure.
see myself. All right. Thank you very much, Fosco, for sharing your project with us. I think I can speak for many people sitting here that STOP has been a wonderful, a repository for ideas, for student and for architect, for educator like myself. Just two quick questions. Now you coined the term exquisite corpse many times in the presentations, and I think it's very appropriate for STOP as a visual atlas. But many of these ideas are from 20th century. It's very provocative. It's where you can actually there's this idea when 20.
Oh.
Yep. I think we lost him.
Oh
Okay.
no. I think I'm back here because they promoted me into a panelist. So sorry about that. And I lost my.
It was cut,
sorry,
but now you're online again. Yeah.
I'm back. Okay, so fundamentally 20th century, you have so many ideas that coming out. Can you evaluate on 21st century idea? Do they share the same kind of focus or provocations and excitement that like for example, I know you mentioned Aureli, Pierre Vittorio Aureli, but what other architecture ideas would you consider part of your visual atlas? So that is something that's the first question. So maybe let's have that first.
It's very interesting. It's a very difficult question. I would maybe answer in a kind of a lateral way, maybe not directly. Well, first off, we believe, but it was maybe more explicit in other lectures that we did like up to some years ago, that the contemporary landscapes of the internet somehow relates to different paradigms. When I refer to the exquisite corpse for us, it's not so much only the work that we do in SOCs that is related to that, but it's the internet as a whole, which is an exquisite corpse. If you consider the internet as a kind of ongoing production of millions of people working together without knowing that, without consciously doing that, instead of 10 artists like it happened during the surrealist times, during Breton times, when a series of artists could somehow work together without each one knowing exactly what the other one was doing and to continue work. So for us, in a way, the exquisite corpse is a paradigm, one of the paradigms of the contemporary internet. And when I say internet, I'm not just saying the actual technology which in itself, but also the kind of contemporary culture which is part of our landscape, theoretical landscape today. The other realm would be for us the atlas, the way also that all this content somehow needs sometimes to be structured and to be put together to produce new content, which is also something that you can find on the internet, in the social media, in the in website like in Tumblr and so on. So basically, these two paradigms come from our experience of the internet and could be of influence to contemporary culture. Then, in terms of contemporary architectural realm, it's difficult to give you specific names that somehow guide contemporary production. Of course, I cited Per Vittorio Aureli, but there are many many thinkers that interest us, not so much in a way that somehow they can find echo in what we do, apart from the most classical teaching activities that we do for design students, for example, in a school. Of course, we let the students get in touch with different thinkers. We believe that what is most interesting maybe today, but it's in a way not so much that you find echo in our own work, is the way that architectural design is somehow investigating itself, the architectural world, investigating itself in the actual political content they do. That architecture is not something neutral. Today, you produce architecture, and it's not something that is only for the common good, but it's something that can be problematic and sometimes. So what I refer to also as this debate in the Polytechnic Institute in Lausanne was also about shall we teach the students an history which is somehow apparently neutral in the way architecture has worked over the centuries and the way we live still today, or is some kind of just one take of how architecture was actually produced and spread, and information was given about that production over time. So of course, all this is, I think it's what is most interesting today is to try and understand and questioning ourselves in the design realm at large. So not just architecture itself, but also graphic design, product design, and so on, on how you can have at the same time a voice for the audience, which is in any case vast and heterogeneous, without losing the idea that what you do is not completely neutral, and at the same time hoping for your work to be useful not just for one individual person, but for the common good, let's say. So it's this what's most interesting for us. But as you can see, is not so much that we can find in this lecture. What we find in this lecture again is probably trying to find a common basis, because if you say that our mental activities come from our body relationship with space, then you can say that by that you can find ways of accumulating, putting all together by the same characteristic. We have different bodies, but more or less we have similar bodies, more, you say, and we have the ways of relating with space and relating with the way we design spaces in a way, by the fact that we have a body and we move in space and we use the environment for that. So basically we have this in common. And this is much stronger than our the way we relate to our local cultures and local context, let's say. I don't know if I explained that. It's a very complex topic of reflection, but this is pretty much what we are trying to work on this time.
Hopefully we'll get to hear the next steps, the research as well. In terms of in my second question, obviously, we talk about architecture as a intellectual discourse. Like a lot of what you have done, you move from one place to another. It's a discourse, and it's to quote to me here, it's a form of knowledge rather than knowledge of form. But as an practicing architect, I still think that the building and construction has some very important part of discipline. Now, however, under you probably obviously is an architect yourself. Under the pressure of all the neoliberal conditions and value engineering and many other things, I recently was tasked with designing a data center. Basically, it's almost very functional and almost soulless, and there's nothing to do with people anymore. So, do you think that architects still have a chance, as a built environment or object, to be part of an intellectual discourse, or are we destined to be like what Fabrizi said, only critical on paper and digital platform, or is there any way out? So what is your experience in this case, or like if you can share that?
If I understood correctly, it's a very, very, very interesting question. But yeah, you're right. There are many architects today that somehow try to preserve the idea that architecture is a conceptual work, but even, and and above all, I would add, by the fact that architecture today doesn't have any content in a way, no? Doesn't, in your case, almost literally, because the data center is basically a container of something that you cannot really deal as an architect. It's machines and so on. And it's the case for data center or I don't know, Tesla factories and so on. So architecture is pretty much for these people, for these thinkers and practicing architects, a kind of activity that is somehow synthesized by the actual thin line in between the interior and the exterior. There's architecture is. We still believe that architecture has content, and it can have content and meaning also when you design this kind of buildings in a way, because architecture is much more profound than an actual host of activities in a way. So yeah, that's interesting that you are asking that, because I'm referring, for example, to Castellers of the practice office, Castellers Nabil Manseren, of course, that produce a long lasting teaching activity on that idea of architecture without content, which is a provocative activity, of course. But we believe that architecture can still have a dialogue in that, and we are foster an idea that architecture is a complex domain in which we need practicing architects to produce actual theoretical content and not just thinkers. You know what I mean? So it's something that need architects that deal with everyday reality of today, producing architecture itself, instead of just people that write book. So it's very important. Then is architecture still connected solely to producing actual buildings? No, not necessarily today. An architect, a practicing architect can be someone who produces spaces in a video game for us, who produce a book in a way of designing, not so much the book itself, but designing the content of this book in an architectural way. So the architectural practice today is something much more, let's say, even interesting in a way, despite the limitations than it used to be. I don't believe the architecture has necessarily to deal only to buildings, but it doesn't have to rely only on a special practice only again. So it can have also a way of producing buildings and producing theories against this background of producing buildings in a way.
So I think wearing many hats is a way forward then.
Excuse me?
Wearing many hats is a way forward, meaning
exactly.
having different...
Yeah.
So
you can have many hats at the same time. Right.
Right.
I might just add a little bit to that final talk, because I think it's very interesting that like the question that was just raised just then. It's like this idea of like somehow that contemporary architects seem to be trapped in a certain situation. I think that like research and especially like activity, like critical activity through exhibition, even like through like writings and other form that outside the, I guess, orthodox model of architecture, is actually a way to remind us that like architecture originally was actually not so much like like I don't know, like limited as we perceive it nowadays. I mean, even the question about like when you talk about machine, because it's interesting that like in the book, in Vitruvius' book 10 Book of Architecture, machine is actually part of architecture. And the fact is that machine was actually the idea that like typical building is just it's in one place, it couldn't move. Machine is actually about moving things. So it's like this idea of like movement that like that was not even like a thing in contemporary architecture. Architecture would never think about it, a building would move. So it's so like interesting, just have like to remind about like through research and through maybe perhaps other provocative activity, it's kind of remind us that like, well, we actually like quite capable by doing a lot of other things, and like
it's true. No, it's another kind of translation, but it's true what you're saying, that about the relationship between movement and architecture, there have been some kind of contradictory. They are considered contradictory today. Something stable and permanent, is something dynamic and in movement, and it used to be architecture also the machine. You're right, completely.
I think we got a reminder.
Yeah. Sorry for interrupt you guys, but thank you anh Lê Đức for very wonderful questions. I think we out of time already, but is it okay for us to have like one more question for the physical space audience here? If it's
Of course.
okay for you.
Of
Okay.
course.
Ở đây có ai có câu hỏi không? Well, then if not, then I maybe I can I have a questions for you. Okay, so in the very first slide, I saw the words you say you use, that is pure curatorial practice, or yeah, something like that. And here in the audience, we have several curators. In Vietnam, the curators is something still very new, and even more so to most of architecture exhibition here in Vietnam. We don't have such role. So can you share us a little bit about how is that like working with architects instead of with clients, and how the important role of curators, more architectural curators. Thank you.
Thank you for this question. Yeah, I would say that we're kind of peculiar curators. I wouldn't generalize what we do as as kind of a general practice. Let's say we work on exhibitions that we yes, that we curate and design also, but we curate not so much exhibitions in we would have so many works of from architects. You know what I mean. It's more exhibitions in which we materialize the research that we can do across a vast panorama of works in the history of architecture and in the arts, that we propose in an exhibition in different formats. Sometimes we also ask other architects to produce specific works for us. Sometimes we feature works that we know from other architects, but it's a very kind of peculiar ways of producing an exhibition. Basically, they also, well, there have been a lot of exhibitions on architecture over the last decades. Of course, I'm not saying that curators do not exist here in Europe or in the States for specific architectural shows, but it's also true that, as I was saying to Mr. Kim, actually, it's showing architecture is very difficult in a way. It's very complex, and there are always, if you can look at the debate, there are always there's many criticism, lots of criticism against architectural exhibition, because they fail most of the times in showing what architecture is. So in a way, we somehow avoid going that direction. We cannot say that we are curators of the architectural realm, but we are curators more in general. In a way, we materialize some kind of content that can be expressed architecturally. But this is a kind of complex question, and what we would like to contrast is the specialization, this time in terms of specializing in of these activities. Of course, there are professional curators, as in there are practicing architects, as in there are professional researchers. We do not like this kind of compartmentalization of the activities. I think that, again, I always try to express the idea that, a practicing architect can be a curator, and it's a different figures than a professional curator. It's a person that somehow has his legs in different buckets in a way, and which can give as a result a kind of non-academic, maybe I wouldn't say amateurish kind of practice, but more, let's say, more spontaneous, not related somehow to inner rules. More experimental, more tentatively conducted, but for us very interesting at the same time.
Okay, I think we will end it here today. Thank you, Fosco Lucarelli, for a very wonderful speech. Thank you, Mr. Kim, for such a wonderful questions also. And this lecture is recorded, so we will have it somewhere on YouTube. Hopefully that is with the transcriptions, Vietnamese transcriptions, and Vietnamese in audio. And also, I would like to thank you again for Phu Lang Sa and the Cricket Project for support for this event. And we will also have others architectural lectures and film screening in the near future. So thank you very much, Fosco.
Thanks again to you as well. I hope we stay in touch. It was very beautiful to be able to give this speech to across the world. Thanks again.
Thank you, Fosco. It was wonderful to have chat.
Thank you.